All right, welcome to SIG Auth for May 13th, 2020. The main item that we have on the agenda today is discussing dynamic audit and different options for the path forward. We're going to jump right into that because we keep getting to that last and not having enough time. So we'll start there, and then Mo, I added your KEP on at the end if we have time to talk about that a bit more as well. So a reminder of where we left off, we had two proposals. One for basically taking the existing functionality of dynamic audit and moving it out into a separate process, and I called this the dynamic audit proxy webhook design. And so basically the audit proxy would be set up as a static webhook to the API server, and then that would manage the dynamic syncs from there. Another approach is to keep the dynamic webhook syncs managed by the API server, but have them use the exact same event stream that's going to the static syncs, meaning they share the static policy. And Mo, I see that you added another option. Do you want to talk through that briefly?
Yeah, it's rough, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to make a little diagram or anything. But I just wrote down some thoughts. At a high level, I was just curious, and I know there had been some discussions in the past before dynamic audit was a thing. And I think Tim, you were the first one to propose it. I think around a more pull-based model instead of a push-based model. Now, I know there's a lot of concerns around like HA API servers, and we'd have to try to work through that. But I was curious if folks thought that if we, if we try to offload like every request to the API server can cause an audit event, which it does try to like emit to a sync sort of in the background. Like, do we feel like if you had the sync come to the API server and try to pull data out as best as it can, if that improves like any of the performance characteristics that we need? Or is it just like the same problem in a different way? So I had some I had a vague idea of like maybe the API server just writes to a file and the API just reads from that file. But this is not like a file like meant to be human readable. It's just basically a way of offloading to the file system, like a set of state that is then reused. So that's kind of what I had. It's not really a strong design or anything. I just was kind of curious if folks felt like if any problem is solved by inverting the model.
I think this is probably most similar to the, what are we calling that model? The dynamic webhook syncs with static policy, in that you still have, you're still using the static policy, I assume, in this model. And you still need to potentially serialize the event and send it over n different connections. Yeah, I'm not sure if the performance characteristics would be any different. Not sure if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
I think if you opened a stream and I know you had maybe talked about streaming that would maybe help a bit performance-wise. You would run into concerns over whether you have a lazy stream consumer, so you would still have to buffer on the other side of it, but that might help a bit.
Would that be better than having a stream from the push-based webhook though? Once the stream is open, isn't it kind of the same work?
Yeah, I guess it doesn't matter too much once you have it open. The other advantage, I guess, was auth is easier in this model. Not that I think it's a huge deal, because generally you're proxying out to some pod running on the cluster, but it is nice that you can kind of use the existing auth, cluster auth for it. The piece that's hard is definitely the aggregated servers. I mean, I don't know how that would work. It almost turns, you know, an API endpoint into something that's stateful, as, you know, the states stored on each server, as opposed to right now the API server is basically stateless. So
yeah, it's also not obvious how you would handle things like don't shut down the server till you sent these audit events, which is hooks we have in there today.
right, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a little more lossy, I think. But so.
Yeah, I feel like it would have to be a kind of best effort thing. And I'm not sure that we would even need to store the events in a file. I think we could just say events are streamed from once the connection is opened. And if you lose your connection and reconnect, then you're going to miss out on some events in that gap. Not sure if we need stronger guarantees for this, but even a dynamic, any sort of dynamic webhook isn't going to be able to have the same guarantees as the static hooks, I think.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lesser guarantee to it, just in general. But
do we have like what would like I know we try and we'll try to send events out, right? But you know I've heard folks say that you know like I would prefer if you can't write the audit event, I would prefer you to fail the request, right? And I don't think that's realistic in our
We already
architecture.
implemented that.
We
I
have
think
that?
we ruled that out for dynamic just because we didn't want someone applying a YAML and then crashing the, you know, basically locking yourself out of the API server if they couldn't, you know, those events couldn't reach the end goal. That was at least the reason why it was originally done.
So that,
I think there may be
understood.
environments where that. I was just going to say there may be some environments where that would be the required behavior.
Yeah, I think when we originally did dynamic audit, it was just we decided that was too risky, so we just said that use case we wouldn't satiate.
Yeah, we do support that for static webhooks, but I agree that it's not feasible for dynamic.
So I guess question for you, Tim and David. Is it that if you have a static webhook today and say like you issue a write request and we can't write to the static webhook, we would fail the write before it hits etcd?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that like implemented through dry run or something? I'm just kind of curious now.
It's configurable.
Okay. But yeah, it does make sense that if it's dynamic,
there's some flag that says.
And that's because people use their audit trails to be, you know, sure of what just happened.
Did we want to go over the other designs? Mine was just really a straw man. It wasn't really like I didn't expect anyone to actually go for this. I just wanted to give at least one more option to our three choices or our two choices.
I mean, you can already do this thing today with if you output to a file. I mean, there's already flag in the API server to do so, and then you simply have like a log collector like FluentBit or Logstash or whatever. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's more of you can't do that through like the Kube API, right? So yeah, I mean, if you can control all the flags and do whatever and have something co-located with the master, you probably don't really need dynamic webhooks at all, right? You just do it directly.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the auth story for this. I think the auth story is really nice, but I just don't know how you get past the aggregated servers. I can't think of any like reasonable way to do that unless someone has a better idea.
Okay, so I think we still have this sort of open question of, do we pull the behavior out into a more of a proxy model, or do we try to come up with some sort of compromise that unblocks progress for the in-process model? I think that's kind of the fundamental question here, and then like what that compromise or kind of how we architect that is maybe a little more of an implementation detail at this point.
I mean, my main concern there is just getting people to, provisioners to be able to kind of create this stuff. Like I've mentioned before, it's really hard to get, them to even flip a flag. And that's just, requiring them to really not do much of anything, but kind of understand the risks. But asking them to install whole things side by side. And there's also a cost to it where you're now sending all of your audit events to the sync in the chance that you might use dynamic audit. And you don't even know if that's the case when you're signing up for that. So you're already kind of both exposing those events, and you're taking a tax just to have dynamic audit. And I think that overhead is just going to make it really hard for people to adopt. So my fear there is just, going with that model, we just wouldn't have adoption, and the feature would kind of die. So I think that probably sums up my concerns.
I would ask another sort of, it's a meta question. If say we go with the first design, the proxy design, Tim, is anyone signing up to actually work on it? Is there a community interest?
Wouldn't you expect that to be done by the people who are interested in dynamic audit if they care?
If the design doesn't meet what they want, then they wouldn't bother, right? Like I'm not sure that anyone from VMware would work on it, right? So
well, no one from VMware's worked on this one either.
Which one?
We're talking about it because this is a design that's been outstanding for like a year, right?
All right, but it was done by people who are VMware employees now. It was Heptio back then, sure. Like, I guess I'm just really asking, like, if we pull out the alpha stuff, is it just easier to say that's it? Like, if no one's going to actually do anything else, I mean, it's alpha. It's kind of, isn't that what it means to be alpha?
Sorry, I didn't follow that. Are you proposing leaving it in alpha?
No, I mean, if you remove it, you don't have to replace it. You could just say it's not a wanted feature.
Right. Also, part of the motivation of the audit proxy model is to unblock development, to make it a lot easier to prototype and move forward with the design of that outside of core. And then if we end up with a design that we're happy with and meets performance requirements and whatnot, we could consider taking some version of that back into core. Doesn't necessarily, pulling it out of core doesn't necessarily preclude adding it back someday.
I guess like my concern there is just losing the functionality of being able to just configure sync without needing to, flip API server flags and have access on that level. And that provides a lot of utility today to products. So we would just be kind of losing that utility.
Well, we aren't
because
losing
can't-
it. We don't have it, right? Like this is alpha. Our recommendation is that people don't turn this on outside of a toy to see what it does. So we aren't losing it. What we're talking about is for a path forward, what would we expect to see? We haven't seen development in tree. Maybe being out of tree will foster a sense of ownership, and we will see development in this area around things like the policy for how the dynamic audit would actually run out of tree. And yeah, it's another affirmative step, same as the affirmative steps today, to be able to make it happen.
I mean, there's been a bunch of work on the policy, right? Like there's been a whole lot of work done on the policy and there just hasn't been agreement, right? I can't help but wonder if there's, a compromise, just use the static policy and that's what's holding it up and not lose the sync portion.
Am I misremembering? This is alpha, so to use it, I have to explicitly configure it, right? And put it in alpha state, or I might just not remember the correct state of this API.
Just to be clear, are you suggesting using like a static policy on the in-tree main audit sync?
Yeah, just using the static policy to send out to various syncs. So the syncs are dynamically configurable, the policy is not. Which is kind of
so the syncs would get the exact same audit stream that the static webhook gets today. And that would let us optimize the performance a bit. You wouldn't have to kind of maintain different versions of the audit event through the pipeline, and would kind of simplify the logic to what it is today. And then just let us copy the serialized event into the different streams, output streams.
That would remove my objection to the name audit. If you can dynamically change what the fields are and is it really an audit, but yeah.
So what I'm sort of hearing is that the argument for keeping it in the API server is so that like provisioners, which I think mostly means cloud providers, will enable it.
I mean, it's not just cloud
GKE
providers. Like it's any provisioner. Like we went around a bunch of different cluster provisioners, right? And I mean, cloud providers is part of it, but a lot of the open source provisioners even had trouble. They have requirements around what they can do and whatnot. So.
Speaking for GKE, even if this was built into the API, we would be forced to disable it with the current design today. I don't know if I can go into the details of why, but
I actually
need to have more control of the stream.
I actually mentioned this previously. We do pre-processing, so when a SRE or support person looks at a cluster on Dev Console, they're going to authenticate to Kubernetes API servers as themselves, and we do that to track what support people access customer data. Before we push those events into cloud audit logging, they undergo pre-processing to transform those admin emails to like something like Google or at Google. I forget what the exact email is, but if and it has happened in the past, if we do see employees emails in cloud audit logging, we consider that a privacy incident, and it's kind of a stop everything P0 event to go and make sure that that's not happening. So yeah, as I mentioned before, it is going to be very difficult for us to turn this on, or actually it's going to be impossible to turn this on without a hook to do pre-processing. And the raw audit stream is not something that our lawyers would let us externalize.
I think given the amount of time that this feature has had, I would agree with Patrick that a lot of work has been done, and I don't want to minimize that. A lot of effort has been put into it, but it still has not reached a place that we see it moving forward. So I think the out of tree approach could solve some use cases. I agree it is not as nice in other ways, but I think unblocking that experimentation is valuable, and I don't see the current approach moving forward. So I know it is, I don't know if difficult is the right term. It's not pleasant to take something that a lot of effort has been put into and say, it doesn't look like this is going to move forward. But practically, that seems like where we're at.
I mean, the only thing blocking it's the policy, though, right? And we could iterate on the policy out of tree. So, I mean, that's the only, there's been a ton of effort put into the policy, and that's just blocked the entire API. But it doesn't need to, right? So without the policy, would the API still be blocked?
So Tim and Mike, if I could ask a clarification question. So say, you know, this was like done, like there was some API design we were happy with, it lets you read streams. Can you ever enable it in GKE if you need a pre-process hook?
If we built a pre-process hook, I think that it's a possibility. But yes,
I'll
we
tell
would
you,
have to.
I am not swayed by the notion that GKE can't turn it on, so we can't do it. That doesn't sway me at all. Like, I would build lots of things that GKE can't turn on.
Sure, absolutely. I'm just giving if the
Sure.
objective here is to like get it on everywhere, I'm just giving the GKE perspective.
Yeah, no, I
I
still
don't mean
think
to
that
imply that.
Hasn't progressed. I think it's just time to cut bait, and it can come back when it has a more complete solution that satisfies what we're looking for to move forward. But it's been a long time. I don't remember which release it went in precisely, but it's been there a while.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd use the euphemism, like, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Like, there's still useful parts to this. The reason it hasn't progressed is there just hasn't been agreement on the policy. But there's still like useful functionality that can be used by a lot of people. So we could separate out those pieces and not lose everything.
We could also take those pieces and put them into a out-of-process webhook. I think a lot of the kind of framework around the backends could pretty easily be transferred over.
I don't think anyone's going to turn that on. I just don't see enough like motivation to use that.
Well, I guess we can try to decide how to proceed here. My advice is probably to cut it. I don't know where everyone else sits.
To me, the two pieces that make me agree with David are that there's evidence that it wouldn't be on everywhere, and only having the sync and not having the policy seems like an incomplete solution to me.
But I mean, that's still useful. Like, it's incredibly useful in a lot of scenarios. Like, yeah, it's not as complete as we'd like it, right? But like, perfect is the enemy of good, and we have something good that's useful, and now we're just throwing it out because we don't have something perfect, which is the perfect policy.
Yeah, before we commit to
let
a
me
path
propose
forward
a
on this,
path.
I think I would want to see it proved out. Like see people using using this or something different that did include policy. And I think the only way to prove that safely without committing the project to a path that doesn't have a clear future is to do it out of tree.
Jordan, I don't know if I follow that argument, right? Like that argument to me almost sounds like we should never build anything in alpha in Core Cube.
It means that you shouldn't bring anything into alpha in Cube without being able to agree on the objectives for GA and give strong evidence that you're going to be able to achieve those objectives. I think in this case, what we found is that the objectives for GA don't appear to be meetable from where we are today, and we've had a lot of time to try to get there, and we haven't made progress. And so letting something develop free of the constraints of being inside this Cube project and then come in with a full story seems like a clear path forward for those interested in the project, as opposed to the permanent stuck state we're in right now, where we aren't moving forward and we aren't moving backward. Like this looks like the worst possible state to me right now.
Right. It's a design and a clear path to GA. That's what I would look for before adding things in tree. And this added, you know, a third of what was needed in my view. Sort of the sync portion, the policy portion, and will this actually be a consistent surface that's available in most environments? To me, those are the three pillars of this being useful and a common enough thing that we could do it in tree. And this has 1/3 of that, and there aren't clear paths to the other 2/3. And that's what I would want to see before we committed the project to a direction.
I mean, I just don't think you're ever going to have enough adoption going out of tree and running a separate process like that to find anything useful out of it. Having, you know, just the syncs configurable, now you can iterate on policy much easier as you have more adoption, you can get more people using it. And just taking configurable syncs to GA seems like a pretty easy, reasonable thing that's useful to lots of people. Like, I don't hear really any disagreement on that functionality. Right.
Oh, sorry, I thought that it was clear that Google disagreed and Red Hat disagreed.
Disagreed in what sense? I mean, Google's saying they can't use it.
We're not being able to be able to say, send all my audit stuff here. Not sure what audit stuff you're going to get, but definitely send it to this location is not awesome, right? Because we can't say what's actually going to show up there. And I thought I heard that Google had the similar concerns, like just being able to say, send all the audit there.
I mean,
I don't know what I'm sending you.
I mean, you could configure it with the static policy, right?
And you can also more or less do it with mutating and validating hooks already, let's say, in a similar way. So you can have like a mutating and validating hook, which is acting like as an audit sync, more or less. So you can achieve, let's say, the same behavior.
Pretty expensive, right? You're asking for every
yes. Yeah, but again, it's possible to ship like all those events as well, if you're really keen on doing something like this, and you get like the user ID there, and then and in the groups of the user, and yeah.
All right. So if I'm understanding what I've heard from Jordan, David, and I guess maybe Tim and Mike as well, would we just deprecate this API and remove it in some number of releases?
No, delete it. It's alpha. Goes away in 119.
Yeah, I guess you don't have to deprecate it if it's alpha. Yeah, I guess the only thing there would be is if you waited to remove it with some basis of, hey, if you can make your external project really cool by some time, maybe we can fix this. I don't know if it matters.
That doesn't seem very compelling to me. If you really want to just keep the data, you can pull out the data and put it into a CRD. If you want to preserve the data and operate against an API and write something against it. I'd like to make sure that all of the maintainers of the audit subproject are in agreement on this. But from my perspective, I think that the alpha implementation should be removed.
Who are the owners of the audit subproject?
I didn't actually know we had one. I thought it was just a SIG Auth project.
I'm assuming Jordan's not making it up.
No, I'm not. I just dropped it into the Slack SIG Auth channel.
You're gonna see Jordan listed like 5 times.
I hope not. There we go. That's exciting. I'm not sure Stefan has been involved since this was first added.
Yeah, he's done onesie twosie.
I would not like to be the sole decider on this, since I think Google has a biased position on this. I'd love to hear from other provisioners if anyone else is on the call.
So we got Micah from AWS. Do we have anyone from Azure on the call? I don't necessarily see anything. Did Micah drop?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm worried about the performance characteristics. Like, I don't like for our customers, we do supply like CloudWatch logs, like a log stream with the audit event stream. We don't have the same concerns today around filtration of audit, but I could very easily see us getting to the point where that would be the same concern for us. I did ask our product folks, like, have we had any requests for like any kind of dynamic audit or even a different sync from any of our customers for the audit log? Like, do they want it to S3 because it's cheaper, or do they want it to, anywhere else? And they said they'd never heard any requests. So that doesn't mean that no one wants it, but that just, we've not heard of any like customer driven requests for anything like this on the service side.
We also, we provision a lot. We haven't seen a lot of demand for this. The inability to actually say what goes where and not actually know what's going out makes it just impractical for us to use.
So David, I
Yeah,
remember
same for the
OpenShift.
GKE side.
Sorry, I was gonna say, David. So I remember OpenShift has like a static, like mostly metadata only policy.
Yeah, it's for a different purpose written to disk, right? It's like a short-term memory, but it's not meant for let's configure everywhere to try to do
No, that's fair. I was more curious. So you haven't had any customer ask for more audit events than what's in there?
Not for dynamically configuring their syncs to receive whatever audit happens to be configured, right?
No. I meant at a higher level. Have you had requests for, I want to configure the policy and maybe the sync, but at least the policy?
Yeah, for configuring policy, and we have ways to do that, right?
Yeah, and we also have, like, I don't think we've had any customers ask to like change the audit policy either. Like the audit policy we have, I think we maybe have like 2 or 3 requests to like know what the contents of that policy are, but no one's ever asked for that to be changed.
Micah, do you guys use like a pretty broad policy, or is it like metadata?
It's like the standard documented one plus like maybe like additional logging on like the AWS auth config map.
Is there any sort of mailing list of Kubernetes certified distributors? Or, well, that's the Product Security Committee distributors list. I'm wondering if there's a broader one of like provisioners. But we could just use the distributors list. My proposal was going to be to get more feedback from, we're making decisions on this based on provisioner standpoints, and so it might make sense to send out some sort of questions or requests for feedback to all Kubernetes distributors.
Just something from my side. So we are currently allowing our end users to specify like the policies, the audit wall policy, but this is again, it's a static policy. But there were some use cases from different our end users which were asking, for example, per specific audit things per, for example, for their custom resources or something like this. And yeah, so for us, it's okay with the entry, and hopefully, if it's gone, then we can again move into out of tree. So.
If we were going to take this to a broader audience, I would probably frame it as this is what we are planning to do for these reasons, and see what the response is to that, rather than take something that, even with the voices we already have, we've had basically an intractable time figuring out a path forward. I don't think there's any way that taking it to a broader audience is going to make it clearer or easier to find a path forward on this. I think letting distributors or users know the plans is okay, but I would probably frame it as here's this alpha thing. We've struggled for a long time to find something that would be usable in many environments and would provide these characteristics, and we haven't been able to. The plan is to remove it, and the recommendation is to use the statically configured one with an out-of-tree implementation if you are interested in distributing to other backends. And that's what I would communicate.
Okay. I guess one of us should write down the proposed path forward and at least send that out to SIG Auth for additional feedback.
We should have asked Stefan to do it.
If someone wants to start a doc and maybe add the SIG Auth TLs and SIG Auth mailing list to it, we can collaborate on there. And I think sort of copying some of the earlier notes from earlier discussions would be a good starting point.
Sounds good. I can take a initial stab at that.
Okay.
Mo, I think that gives 15 minutes to talk about dynamic authentication. Probably has some similarities to this.
Nicer? There, like this little bit highlighted. If you folks have any thoughts on this, because this is like super benign. It's just that it's an API change. So the context is if you configure an exec provider, aka you downloaded a kubectl from somewhere, and you don't have the binary that you're supposed to exec, you get somewhat of a cryptic message. We can obviously make the message better. Do we care enough for sort of a quality of life improvement to have some kind of hint that could be included in the kubectl that would be printed out to the screen, like, I see you're trying to use such and such exec plugin. Please use brew to go install it, or apt, or whatever. Any thoughts?
I like it.
I kind of like it.
That sounds useful.
David, what did you say?
I said I like it. I think that would be a good idea.
Okay. I will add that to the GA or not the GA, the improvements to the CAP that I've been doing. Okay. All right. Tim, do you want to open the link for the 1689? All right. Yeah. 12 minutes. Okay. Cool. So yeah, there is an incredible amount of discussion on this thing already, but there's plenty more to be had. Yeah, I mean, so Mike and Tim, I know you guys have read it and had made comments, which I responded to. Is there particulars that are still outstanding that you guys feel need discussion?
Yeah, I would really like to dig into what makes the authentication proxy approach not the right approach.
Other than it's a hack?
How is it? So yeah, that's what I'm pushing back against.
Yeah. So I mean, what it effectively does is it allows us to say that it's not our problem without actually addressing anything, right? Like, I don't think impersonation was ever built for what we're proposing to do with it. David's here; he can tell me otherwise.
Well, impersonation isn't the same as a front proxy, right?
The only thing that you can do generically is using impersonation. I know we keep calling it front proxy, but
no, there's a front proxy. I mean, I remember writing it, the request header values.
No, I understand. Those are not exposed or configurable or usable in any environment, right? Like, you don't expose them.
Maybe I misunderstood. I could have sworn I made arguments for them.
No. The point is that impersonation is the only thing today, which has been recommended in the past, that you could generically deploy as a proxy on any environment and it would work. Right?
Oh, you're saying that if you don't have control of the actual Kube API server args, you can't set a front proxy.
Yeah, which if you can do that, then just set the webhook, like, right? That's what I mean.
It's sort of the same. It's sort of parallel to the discussion we're just having about audit.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, the distinct difference is you can already do this using an impersonation proxy. It's just extremely second class and, to me, dangerous, right?
So how do we make it not second class? How do we evolve this so that it's first class?
How do you make it so that I don't have to talk to some proxy to get my auth? How do I talk directly to the API server as I normally would and get the new auth? Like, I think that is a core requirement. Like, it is meaningless to try to build this as a proxy because you can't, like, how do you tell anyone there's this proxy, and why are some users asserted by the proxy and some users asserted by the API server in some weird mix match way, right? Like, if you go to like Kube or IDC proxy, the first thing it says is please don't ever use this because you should never do this. Right?
I feel like I'm a little bit lost. I'm sorry. Mike, do you understand? What's
I think there's two different. I think there's two different proxies being discussed here, and we should be careful to distinguish between them. There's the impersonation. Sorry.
Never mind.
Just to clarify, there's the impersonation proxy, and then there's the statically configured, I don't know what you call it, proxy.
Request header.
But doesn't use request header proxy. There we go.
Yeah, so I was noting with the request header / front proxy thing, that's not exposed in any environment, nor should it be, right? It's not meant to be exposed in that way, right? Like you should not have access to the private key required to cause the API server to look at those headers, even if I don't even know how you would know what the headers were, but you should not be able to tell the API server using that private key that this is an identity, and there's no like I'm allowed to assert this identity arbitrarily, right? Impersonation lets you assert an identity, but at least it tracks that you are impersonating. And it's just basically, if you imagine you have a cluster admin proxy that is in between all requests, or sorry, not all requests, some random subset of requests that you tell some random subset of people to go to, it can assert an identity, right? And this works arbitrarily across any provider because you cannot disable impersonation. And you cannot configure impersonation anyway. It has no knobs, right? But saying that you should build like an impersonation proxy, wire it up to some CRDs, and I guess some various random admission webhooks to try to protect the CRDs then, is somehow like secure and safe and a good thing to do. Also, never mind that if someone tries to impersonate a request to the impersonation proxy, now you have to figure out what to do with that request. Right? Like I have gone over most of these concerns in like one of the comments, but that's the general point, right? Like you cannot like meaningfully do this in that way.
Did someone suggest that someone should do this?
Yes, that's what Mike keeps saying we should do.
Oh.
I'm not saying that we should do this. I'm saying that we should figure out what is preventing this from being a viable, stable solution to this problem. We are transitioning to a model where we want to build extensions. This seems rather limiting in what it allows. I think a model where we invest in some way that can use impersonation or another mechanism to portably build authentication proxies that you can deploy on any cloud would be valuable for reasons of extensibility in the future, and to take some of the stuff that people want to experiment with, and allow that to happen out of tree to unblock people.
Would you actually be
I would argue, Mike, that this KEP does that because I know you had made the comment that, this doesn't support Kerberos or whatever. It's like it doesn't have to directly support Kerberos, right? You can do a Kerberos flow with some other component and get a token and then use that token against the API server, right? All I'm saying is I don't want the Kerberos component to literally be a proxy for all requests, right? Like, yes, a token or a short-lived cert is not as magically good as the API server directly supporting Kerberos, but I don't think we're going to add direct Kerberos support to the API server. Right? And I don't necessarily think we're going to add some weird, like, I don't know, proxy that's not a proxy and it's in the API server somehow. Like,
so I'm surprised, Mike. Would you actually be happy with an outcome where I can hook up a server that says like I'm a system master?
now, to be fair, my KEP says you're not allowed to assert system : identities because it's crazy. But
well, I may or may not agree with that in general, but I'm thinking about, like, do I think that people who wouldn't let someone configure their own authentication would really want someone to be able to impersonate any user they want?
I mean, you can today using an impersonation proxy, right? Like, unless you have a deny authorizer sitting there looking at impersonation requests. Right? And if I remember correctly, there was a comment made by, I think maybe CJ, that you can, in GKE, submit a CSR for system : masters and it'll actually work and be wired up, even though it shouldn't.
I'm still in favor of allowing that too, but
David, I'm not against that one because we have the knob, right? We have the knob to say you can or cannot deploy the admission webhook that will prevent that, or right. So like we gave an option that makes that sort of reasonably safe. But like I'm trying to understand like why we would tell people to use an impersonation proxy, which is significantly less secure than just building in a config, right?
Why is it less secure?
How do I know this proxy is written exactly perfectly, right? It has to.
We know for a fact our code isn't because we wrote it.
Yes, but it's the code that everyone has to use, right? I'd rather have one thing to get correct than an infinite set of random proxies to get correct.
I don't know. I will say I probably trust Apache mod auth more than us.
I don't. The thing is written in C. I don't trust that thing at all.
Fair.
Right? Like, can't even allocate memory correctly, much less get an API correct, right? So, yeah, I mean, like, so the idea would be that there's a dynamic thing hooked up with CRDs, right? Like, that's how you would try to replace this out of tree, right? I don't see that actually being safe, right? You're gonna have some random admission webhooks there, right? Cluster admin can just delete those and do whatever they want with them, right? So that doesn't really satisfy me. How do you guarantee like an RBAC check to make sure that the person touching the CRD is a full cluster admin, as they should be, right? All of these things.
We could write a framework, or like essentially a what am I trying to describe? Like, suppose we wrote the webhook, the proxy thing, and just left an interface and said, like, implement this interface and build your own version of this webhook, then we kind of control most of the trickier bits. And from the user's perspective, or from the developer perspective, they're implementing a similar interface to if they were building the webhook piece to it.
Or we could just do like significantly less work and just wire in an API, right? Like, this API is actually incredibly trivial to build because it just reuses existing code. And I say this having written it already, but that's not the point.
I'm not sure there's uniform agreement that having this level of flexibility accessible via the API is a good idea.
No, so that, David, I think is very fair, right? I'm not saying that we have come to a consensus on that. I'm just saying that we don't need this because there is an alternative isn't fair, because that alternative is significantly worse, right? We're trying to contort it into a series of different alternatives. It's not actually helpful, right? You can say that you just simply
in the comment that I left a couple days ago, I gave 3 reasons why this is problematic, and I'm not proposing that we just say people should use this alternative. I'm saying, what can we do to make this alternative, an implementation using this alternative at parity to what is proposed here, a solution built into the API.
Mike, have you read my response? I addressed all of those comments, right?
Yeah, I have not. I admit that I have not looked at it since this meeting.
Yeah, I mean, in general, guys, like, I need you guys to look at it, because this, like, it's got incredibly positive feedback from people who don't have to maintain the code, right? I need feedback from people that have to maintain and live with this API, right? And that's the leads.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to it. Your most recent comment was like 11 hours ago. I haven't looked at it since this morning. I am sorry.
I have a question. So if it's out of 3, then is it possible to do at all a TOS authentication?
Could you repeat the question?
If it's out of 3, like some other like out of 3 proxy, then is it possible at all to do TOS authentication?
TLS authentication?
I mean, yeah, with the client certificate.
Yeah, so you could have MTLS to the proxy, and then the proxy would impersonate whatever user back to the API server, possibly over MTLS also. So it's not MTLS from you to the API server. It's always MTLS to whatever terminates your connection. Now, you don't actually know, even when you're trying to, like, whatever endpoint you have exposed, when you're talking to it, like, you don't know if it actually makes it all the way to the API server, right? Like, as long as any load balancer or whatever, if it terminates TLS, if it passes all the data back to the API server, it won't actually, like, care that you didn't get MTLS all the way to it.
So we're at time. We'll have to continue some of the discussion on the PR itself. I think one takeaway that I'm hearing here is that we need to try and nail down the requirements a bit more. There seems to be some disagreement on what those requirements are. But yeah, in general, let's continue on the PR and maybe pick up the discussion in 2 weeks, which is also after enhancements freeze. But yeah, I don't know if you were hoping to get this into 1.19.
Yes. As an alpha, right? Not as anything that we have to live with forever.
Says the man who wasn't sure about getting rid of our previous alpha.
I didn't know if you could just delete an alpha. I just didn't know the policy.
All right, we need to cut this off. Thanks everyone for coming. Good discussions today, and see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, guys.